The commanders of the armed forces were all promoted, including Mubarak, now Lieutenant General. An image would later be used during Mubarak's presidency to give the impression that the Egyptian Air Force and its brilliant commander were the sole architects of the 1973 success. With military goals achieved, President Sadat turned his attention to domestic affairs, liberalizing the hitherto strictly controlled economy.
Suddenly, everything seemed to turn upside down. Sadat took a very different line, which was known as the open door policy. And with the opening up of the economy, inflation took place. This was coupled with a big wave of migration to the Gulf.
And there were more changes on the way. In April 1975, Sadat made an unexpected choice. He appointed the commander of the Air Force, Lieutenant General Hosni Mubarak, vice president, surprising everyone, including Mubarak. Up until this point, Mubarak's ambition was to become the head of Egypt Air, or at most, Egypt's ambassador to London.
Sadat
saw Mubarak as the ideal option for two reasons. First, because Mubarak was the least likely to argue with him over policy. And second, because of his lack of interest in competing for power.
Ironically, it was Hosni Mubarak, the man who had seemed the unlikeliest successor, who would later become president. And while Mubarak was content to remain in the background, Sadat was to propel himself into the spotlight in a move which was to provoke outrage throughout Egypt and across the Arab world. In November 1977, the presidential plane landed in Tel Aviv, and Sadat embarked on historic negotiations with the sworn enemy of the Arab world, Israel. 2 years later, a peace treaty brokered by the United States resulted in Egypt being ostracized by its Arab neighbors. In Egypt itself, the peace deal caused an upsurge in opposition. Sadat responded with a sweeping crackdown on all opponents of the treaty, including its most violent antagonists, the Islamists. A step which would ultimately cost him his life. In the days following Sadat's assassination, a presidential referendum was hastily arranged. And there was only one candidate, Mubarak. For the Egyptian people, it seemed that history was repeating itself.
They were about to witness the inheritance of power. Egyptians are used to being ruled by a centralized government, and this originates from the pharaonic era. The pharaoh then was both a ruler and a god. Although the divinity disappeared with time, some of its features have become immortalized through our constitution.
When Hosni Mubarak assumed his new role as president, his actions proved to be just as calculated as those of his predecessors. His early days were marked by apparently compassionate gestures.
He started by setting free the political detainees from Sadat's era in an attempt to create some sort of political stability through an act of forgiveness.
There was an atmosphere of hope and new beginnings in Egypt. In these early years, Mubarak was a popular figure. Egyptians were attracted to the simplicity of their down-to-earth president, who attended football matches and spoke in common language that even the average man on the street could understand.
I got the impression from meeting him that he was an intelligent man who preferred to work around problems than to confront them. I got the feeling that he is not a dictator by nature, or someone who strives to gain as much power and authority as possible.
On the 25th of April 1982, a new era of peace was being ushered in as Israel completed its evacuation of the Sinai. Mubarak introduced his new national project to the Egyptians, rebuilding the country after decades of conflict.
The economic situation in Egypt was terrible. The country was in severe debt, and its infrastructure was damaged. There was a serious need to rebuild road, sewage systems, healthcare and other services which had been neglected. This was a priority during 80s because it was believed that if you worked on building and strengthening the economy, political reform would just follow.
More roads and bridges began to appear, and most Egyptians could see the government was making an effort. But the people needed more than just infrastructure to earn their loyalty.
You can talk to the citizen about new bridges and remind them how difficult traveling was before. Or point out that now they have access to water, a proper sewerage system, and electricity in 99% of residential areas. We have achieved a lot, but people aren't grateful. All they will say is, that is the government's job.
Mubarak's regime had shifted from the bold political gestures of Nasser and Sadat to a safer approach, one that focused on the economy. But some Egyptians suspected they were not the biggest beneficiaries of this new investment.
Over the last 25 years, general expenditure in Egypt has been mainly aimed at benefiting businessmen and directed towards infrastructure. 600 billion Egyptian pounds, that is over $100 billion, was spent, which is a scary figure for a country like Egypt. This would have been useful to the public had the private sector invested in this infrastructure, and if it was developed in compliance with proper standards. Yet you only have to drive along any road in Egypt to see for yourself the effect of corruption.
Politically, things were calm because of the economic stability, because there was an escape route from the pressures of unemployment. There were a number of countries people could go to, and Iraq in particular accepted millions of Egyptians looking for opportunities to work or live.
So long as there was food on the table, many Egyptians were unconcerned about politics. And the Egyptian political system was not yet ready for their involvement either. President Sadat had abolished the single-party system in 1976, but the change was a cosmetic one, and to all intents and purposes, Egypt remained a one-party state.
Sadat was an autocratic democracy, and the Egyptian political experience was one of a society only familiar with the governing power of a single group. And this mentality of the one-party rule continued until now, during President Mubarak's rule. This course of thought was planted in the minds of many politicians.
And Mubarak was happy to drift with the tide. At the start of his presidency in 1981, he had declared that he would only serve 2 6-year terms. But when he was easily re-elected in 1987 and again in 1993, it appeared that a pattern was emerging. With the field free of powerful candidates who could threaten his position, and with no vice president appointed, Mubarak seemed set to stay. It seemed that internally Mubarak had everything under control, and internationally things were also going according to plan. Egypt managed to mend its relations with the Arab countries despite its ongoing peace treaty with Israel.
One of Mubarak's unique characteristics is his ability to control his responses and temper, despite his military background. This prevented Egypt from committing mistakes that often result from political miscommunication. In general, he was very wise when dealing with international politics.
Further afield, Mubarak was also well regarded by the leaders of the United States, Europe, and even Israel. He was respected for his composure and modesty.
President Mubarak realized that he was only one of many players and thereby had to deal his cards cleverly, with a relative level of sensitivity, accuracy, and intellect.
By now, Mubarak was very much the international statesman, but within Egypt, the ghosts of the past were returning to haunt him. During the early 90s, Egypt witnessed a string of attacks against tourists and a number of assassination attempts on members of the regime at the hands of Islamist groups. Mubarak was on their list. Inside Egypt, he ensured he had a high level of protection, but on the 26th of June 1995 in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa, an assassination attempt was carried out against the president. Mubarak escaped thanks to his armored car and the actions of his bodyguards. It was a close call which gained him sympathy and renewed popularity from his people, but it also raised a new question. What would happen if?